The goal in powerlifting is to squat, bench, and deadlift the most amount of weight possible as efficiently as possible. Each of these lifts can be considered a full body lift, meaning that muscles in each major muscle group should be working simultaneously to achieve the same goal, 3 green lights for the lift. The 3 lifts included in powerlifting are the squat, the bench press, and the straight bar deadlift. There are many different techniques that people tend to use in powerlifting, and many are very athlete specific. Squat tends to be the lift with the greatest variety of techniques, with many variables that can affect the lift. To start, you have bar placement, meaning high bar or low bar. You also have hand placement, foot position, stance width, and powerlifting and Olympic shoes versus flat-soled shoes. I typically wear powerlifting shoes, but for the video purpose I chose not to because I want this video to be an instructional video for beginners in powerlifting who most likely wouldn't have all the equipment that top-level powerlifters do. Like I said, these are all very athlete specific. Athlete anatomy tends to be the biggest contributor to different techniques that are used. The techniques that I will be showing in this video are the techniques that are athlete specific to myself. These are in no way, shape, or form better ways of completing the 3 main lifts, but they are the ways that work best for me individually with my anatomical structure. Starting with the squat. Typically, most professionals tend to say that the initial walkout of their squat is the most difficult. You have a substantial amount of weight on your shoulders, so trying to make sure your foot stance and width are where you want them to be, along with trying to find your center of balance before you start your squat, is what can make or break a lift. You only get 1 minute to complete your lift, and most lifters take 15 to 30 seconds of that time to make sure that the bar is secure and they can get their stance where they want it to be. Breathing is a huge factor when you proceed to heavier and heavier weights. If you don't breathe correctly, you will either get stuck down in the hole, unable to stand back up, or you could potentially pass out due to your blood pressure. Before I start my lift, you can see that I take a deep breath in, and this causes my elbows to then rotate underneath the bar as opposed to behind it. If you place your wrists under the bar, you are taking away from pushing the bar into your back, which doesn't do anything for you except force your chest down towards the ground. If you have your wrists under the bar, you are more likely to have a more upright, open chest throughout the entirety of the lift. With the squat, you want to be sure that you keep your abdomen tight throughout the entirety of the lift. I will show you 2 videos where I keep my core tight in the first, and in the second, I don't. You also are going to want to keep a neutral spine throughout the entirety of the lift. From the front angle, you want your body to be as symmetrical as possible. This way, you aren't putting more stress on one joint than the other, which can lead to a catastrophic injury if you overload one way or the other. For this lift, you want your hips and your knees to work simultaneously and not one before the other. If your body is working at the same time, you won't expend energy doing things in steps during the lift. As you can see, at the beginning of this lift, my hips went back before I began my squat down. I'm doing things in steps, which isn't good and expends too much energy throughout the lift. And as I begin to stand up, you can see that my hips and my knees are not working in unison as my knees extend first, and then once they are fully extended, I bring my hips through. From the front angle, you're going to be able to see 2 things. One, my knees begin to cave in as I go down, and then once I get more towards parallel, they begin to bow out. Knees over toes is something that a lot of powerlifting coaches tend to tell their athletes. As I begin to stand up out of the bottom of my squat, you can see that my knees are not symmetrical. This tends to be the point where a lot of catastrophic injury is capable of occurring. You really need to pay attention to how you complete this portion of your squat, as you could potentially tear your ACL, MCL, meniscus, and also potentially rupture your quad. The next lift is the bench press. For the bench press, there really isn't a wide range of variety for ways you can complete the lift. Hand width and leg placement are really the only things an individual can manipulate for themselves during the lift that aren't anatomically limited. The wider your hand width is, the higher risk reward there is for the lift. The wider your hand placement, the less range of motion, which is good for powerlifting, but by widening your hands, the more flexation there is on your wrists, and you're likely taking away power from the press portion of your lift. For the bench press, you want to try and keep your forearms perpendicular to the ground throughout the entirety of the lift. You also want to focus on keeping your elbows at a 30 to 45 degree angle away from your body. You want to retract your shoulders, squeezing together your traps and your rhomboids, which allows for a sturdier pressing platform. Yes, you're pressing from the bench itself, but keeping a tight upper back during the lift will keep your shoulders at lower risk of injury. As you can see, I'm in the bottom portion of this lift and my elbows are about 30 to 45 degrees away from my body, keeping my shoulders safe and my forearms are also perpendicular to the ground. Foot drive is also very important. By keeping your upper back tight, you will have no choice but to do the same with your feet. You can try and press all the weight in the world without foot drive, but you won't come anywhere close to the weight you're capable of pressing with foot drive. With your foot placement, the common misconception is that the further your feet are underneath you, the more weight you can press. This is false. Yes, you want your feet to be underneath you while benching a large amount of weight, but you also want them to be wide enough to allow you to be stable. You want your feet to be slightly underneath you, but wide enough to ensure the weight cannot fall to one side or the other. I personally keep my feet just behind the top of my knees while lying down, and I ensure that my feet are at a comfortable width even before I unrack the weight. By doing this, I know that I have a stable base from head to toe before, during, and after the bench press lift. The bar path for the bench press is also uncommon compared to the squat and the deadlift. You'd assume the bar path for bench is a straight up and down movement, but in all reality, it's more of an arced C movement. By doing this C movement, you keep your shoulders from risk of injury if you were to make it a straight up and down movement. For the squat and the deadlift, you typically try and keep the bar above the midline of your foot throughout the entirety of the lift. For the bench press, you will start with the lift with the bar basically just above your nipples and your arms are extended. As you lower the weight, the bar will break below the pectorals and you will come to a complete stop at the bottom portion of your sternum. Before you can begin your pressing movement, the bar must stop on the chest. This eliminates the lifter's ability to bounce the bar off the chest, which in turn lessens the amount of weight the athlete can press. As you can see here, I didn't do a very good job of keeping my elbows from 30 to 45 degrees away from my body, which put my shoulders at a very high risk of injury. Lastly, we have the deadlift. For the deadlift, there are two different styles that an athlete can utilize to complete their lift. Conventional deadlift is known as standing with your feet about shoulder width apart, bending the knees and the hips, keeping the back straight, core tight, and lifting the weight up off the floor. This typically is more difficult for the taller athletes in the sport because the range of motion is higher than that of a sumo style deadlift. With the conventional style deadlift, you begin to lift the weight with the extension of the knee and slowly bring the hips through, all while keeping your back straight and your core tight. Once the bar clears the athlete's knees, that is when a majority of the hip extension comes into play. Once the bar is above the knees, the athlete can squeeze their glutes, bringing the hips through. Once the athlete locks out their knees, they can begin to set the weight back down. They cannot drop the weight from the top of their lift, otherwise the lift does not count and will not meet qualifications for a completed lift. As you can see here, once the bar passes my knees, I can bring my hips through and I've kept a neutral spine throughout the entirety of the lift. What a lot of coaches tell their athletes is to take the slack out of the bar before they begin their lift. In the following video, you will see as I sink my hips back, the bar starts to bend a little bit as the weight is about to leave the ground. This is known in the powerlifting world as taking the slack out of the bar. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking in a deep breath, making my core tight. I'm flaring my lats and rotating my shoulders down as my hips begin to sink. The bar is positioned at about the midline in my foot. I'm keeping the bar close to my shins as I begin to lift up, and you will see in the two lines that the blue one is where the bar started at, and then the yellow one is me pulling the slack out of the bar. As I begin to lift the bar, you'll notice that I keep my chest up, my spine at a neutral position, and once the bar passes my knees, I bring my hips through and complete the lift with locked out knees. The sumo deadlift is another style of deadlift that many athletes are beginning to utilize more and more as the sport progresses. The sumo deadlift technique has a smaller range of motion than the conventional deadlift, and sumo requires more hip mobility than that of the conventional. The style of deadlift also depends on the athlete and individual as they are picking up a significant amount of weight doing so as comfortably as possible without putting too much strain on the knees or lower back. For me personally, I feel more comfortable using the conventional style deadlift. I may be a taller individual, but I do not have the hip mobility to use the sumo style deadlift to my advantage. I am now showing you the improper way to deadlift. As you can see, I begin the lift by rounding my back, which puts a large amount of strain on my lower back. I don't keep the bar close to my shins. Since my back is rounded so much and the bar isn't close to my shins, this can lead to ruptured or herniated discs in your lower back, along with time away from the sport due to a significant injury in that area. If your back does tend to do this during the deadlift, it is important that you lower the weight on the bar and you work on your technique and your form before you start adding weight. Two examples of the best powerlifters in the world are Russell Orey and Sean Noriega. The two top 83 kilogram powerlifters in the world both are very adamant about how they complete their lifts as efficiently as possible. Russell Orey, who's the number one powerlifter at 83 kilograms, is a conventional deadlifter, whereas Sean Noriega, number two, competes with a sumo deadlift. Sean has a very wide stance and uses powerlifting shoes on his squats. Russell doesn't wear powerlifting shoes and has a narrower stance. As I mentioned earlier, you can't do much to manipulate your bench press other than widening your hands, which is a high risk, high reward outcome. Russell has a pretty decently spaced grip when he benches, and Sean's grip is noticeably much wider than Russell's. Russell brings his hands just out past the ring of the knurling, and Sean's is nearly as wide as the bench rack itself.